Hey everyone, and welcome to The Year Was, a podcast all about today. I'm your host, Michael Montalvo, and together we take the history train back in time once again to discover what makes today truly unique. For the next few minutes, we continue to gather random nuggets of trivia to make you sound smart, or just drop that little fact that makes others stop and say,
"Why are you here?"
Like, seriously, who invited you?
On this episode, we examine the events that occurred today, June 6th. Hey everybody, this is Michael. Just at the top of the episode, I'm just dropping in to say that today we continue our discussion with Matt and Bill, and we talk about the events that happened on June 6th, 1944. Thank you for listening to this episode, and if you haven't already, be sure to check out the previous episode, which we go into the events of June 5th, the day prior to D-Day. But that's going to do it for me here, and thank you, and I'll get you back to the episode. The year was 1944, and the day is June 6th. So, continuing from yesterday, the British Airborne were dropped into France, but because of bad weather and poor pilot navigation, many were dropped inaccurately throughout the division's operating area. So they're just in pockets all around. This caused a number of casualties and made operation more difficult because they had to relocate their position and link up with pretty much anyone that they could. The 9th Parachute Battalion was only able to gather a fraction of its strength before it had to attack the Merville artillery battery, but the battery was successfully assaulted and the guns disabled, and all of their objectives were achieved. So they had to go in and attack this battery, disable it for the Allied troops coming in for the invasion. And luckily they were able to do that with a small number of forces. For the Americans, the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions were dropped behind enemy lines in the early morning hours from about midnight to 2 a.m. They were tasked with capturing Cherbourg, the coastal city of Normandy, and they were assigned the task of blocking the approach into the vicinity of the landing zones at Utah Beach, to capture causeway exits off the beaches, and to establish crossings over the Douve River. I had to write that out so I knew how to pronounce it, and I still think I messed it up.
How's it spelled?
D-O-U-V-E.
Douve.
Douve.
Is there an accent over the E?
You know, there probably was. I just typed it out.
It's Douve if it's not, Duvet if it is.
The airborne assault was divided into two missions, Albany and Boston. Albany's drop zone was just north of Carrollton. Boston was to follow with a drop zone at, and I had to write this one out too, Santa Mech-Église. I don't know.
Oh, St. Mary Église.
Yes, that is much better than what I did. I had to break it up and say it very slowly. What was it, my last episode, or one of the last ones, where I said in a language that I can actually speak. So
you should let me know. I have 2 years of French.
Oh, see, next time I'm just going to call you up.
Yeah.
Like the British paratroopers, the American paratroopers landing didn't go according to plan. And they lost a lot of their gear in the jump and were scattered into pockets by bad weather, poor navigation, and German defenses. But once on the ground, they began organizing and completing their objectives. They had high casualties initially, and what I found kind of interesting was that a significant amount of those casualties were their commanding officers. I wasn't really sure how that managed to happen. It was just one of those things.
And I hear, this is a pilot thing, but when I hear people talk about poor navigation, it's quoted like that a lot.
Yep.
in reference to wartime. Navigation back then was far more difficult than it is now.
Mm-hmm.
Where, especially in low light, whether it's night or fog, in groups of aircraft flying with their lights out, and especially if you're flying cities, because enemies would black out cities. They would illuminate false cities and false landmarks. And so you couple into that bad weather and everything else that's going on, it's tough for anybody to navigate. So it's not like, they were poorly trained.
No,
that's why I always, and I read that all the time. They'll say,
Mm-hmm.
Poor navigation. Everything about navigating then was poor. That's part of the problem.
One of the things I saw too was that they were told to, or the Airborne was actually told to do some of the navigation, and they had just their maps that were basically on their wrists that they had to pull out and go through and try to figure out where they were, where the landing zone was, and how to get to everything. So it was not an easy thing.
Yeah, it was a mess, complete mess.
There were several inherent problems. One, the cloud cover at the flying altitude was intermittent, and it caused a lot of the planes to break apart for fear of running into each other in the cloud cover. Of course, everybody understands that. But once they got over France, the flak was so intense, the pilots were not properly trained for it, and they were trying to avoid the flak. Well, by the time you see a flak explosion, it's too late to do anything about it. It's kind of like trying to dodge lightning. Once it's hit, it doesn't do any good for you to jump and run. So that scattered the planes. Some of them did not throttle back to the appropriate speed. They jumped at a very low altitude. Some of these guys, their parachutes were opening almost the time they hit the ground. And they were carrying a bag, what was called a leg bag, that was attached to the leg and tied to the body with a rope. And they were supposed to release that while they were parachuting down. And the bag would touch first, and that would relieve a little bit of the speed of descent on the parachute. Well, when they jumped from the airplanes at too fast a speed, the prop wash tore a lot of those off. A lot of the men lost their rifles, landed with nothing. That bag was gone. Mm-hmm. People were killed. And, of course, when you drop thousands of men from an airplane at night, you can imagine what happened to these guys. There are accounts of some of them landing in fires in buildings. And I think it was, St. Mary Glee or one of the other cities had a church that was on fire. And one of the guys went right into it.
Yeah, there's not much steering the World War II era conical parachute.
Mm-mm.
For the amphibian assault, at dawn, Allied troops began landing at the 5 invasion beaches, which were Gold, Juneau, Sword in the British sector, and then Omaha and Utah in the American sector. Hans Speidel called Rommel and said that there was a problem. And the article I read said this: Hitler had limited Rommel and other German commanders' ability to respond to an invasion by keeping the authority to commit the German armored reserve to himself. By the time Rommel arrived back at La Roche-Guyon on the night of June 6th, tens of thousands of Allied troops from 6 infantry and 3 airborne divisions were reinforcing their beachheads and supported by overwhelming naval and air forces, and were driving inland. The forces that Rommel immediately commanded were sufficient to slow the Allied advance, but not to throw the invaders back into the English Channel. So they just didn't have the authority and the military power to really make a huge effort or a huge impact on the invasion.
That's absolutely correct. Now, several of the Panzer divisions, Hitler had said, I am the only one that can release those, and nobody dared to wake him up. He had taken a sleeping pill, and he just woke up, I believe it was in the afternoon. Mm-hmm. And, of course, he went into one of his famous rages. But he didn't trust his 2 commanders at Normandy. He played them against each other, and one of them really didn't know what he was supposed to be doing.
If I remember, and I might be remembering this wrong, but Rommel was involved with the plot to assassinate Hitler.
That is correct.
Yep.
Well, I'm not sure. I'd have to read it again. I've never read anything about that in detail, just heard bits and pieces. I'm not sure if he was involved or if he was just implicated, but the bottom line is he committed suicide.
Yep. There were more than 156,000 Allied ground troops that stormed the beaches, and they faced about 50,000 German troops. Stormy seas made the landings difficult, and on Omaha Beach, of the 29 amphibious tanks, only 2 made it to shore on their own power. I think I read that there were another 6 that were eventually brought up there. It may have been a little bit less than that, but there were very few that actually made it.
Yeah, that was the famous dual drive or duplex drive. It was a tank that had rubber skirts around the outside and a framework up from the main body of the tank that allowed it to float. And it had a gearing system that allowed the tracks to run, as well as there were 2 propellers in the back of the tank that would drive it forward. I believe it was 4 or 5 knots. Well, they had not been tested in rough seas, and English Channel was rather rough that day, and a lot of these things sank. And most of the men were able to get out of them, but that's why there weren't but a few that ever made it to shore.
I mean, I knew a little bit about, mostly I know about some of the planes during World War II, but a lot of these land in the amphibious vehicles I didn't really know a lot of, so this was the first time that I really came across this particular one. So that's pretty interesting for me. Included in this assault were 14 Comanche code talkers who landed on Utah Beach. And they would relay, I guess, just information back, just using their own language.
That's interesting. I did not know there were Comanches. I know that the Pacific had the Navajo code talkers.
Yep.
And apparently there were only like 6 people outside the Navajo Nation that could speak Navajo at that time. And they were highly successful. They only had their own coding system. And one of the advantages is that neither of these were written languages. You couldn't go down to a library and pull up a book on Navajo or a Comanche and learn to read and write and interpret.
Well, and it was still something I'd learned about it. I don't remember where. I think one of the last code talkers just died.
One of them did recently.
Recently.
I don't know if he was the last one, but
he was the last of like a Comanche or last of one of the tribes had died. And I kind of went in a wormhole on that, and not only were they using an unwritten language exclusive to the United States, they still made it cryptic, so they wouldn't say the tanks are headed north.
The turtles were headed
they
north.
would, yeah, they would say, there's a cow in the kitchen and it's very mad, or something like that, which meant, so even if they found someone that could speak it, there was still another layer of discovering their cipher. So
I know the Navajos did that. Again, don't remember in anything I've read that Comanches. I'm not saying they didn't.
Yeah.
I just say I did not know that they were involved in Normandy. But yeah, they had their own cryptic code system, so it was doubly difficult.
Mm-hmm. The article I read mentioned Comanche, but if I'm being absolutely honest, it may have been Navajo, and they may have mentioned both of them, and I just wrote down Comanche instead of the Navajo. But yeah, it did mention Comanche going in and doing all of that. For this next bit, I'm going to have to break it down a bit. Now, I mentioned earlier that with everything that happened, and for me, the last couple of days, I've been going and doing all this research and trying to figure out and trying to piece together a timeline for it. There's just so much that happened in this 2-day period that it's barely scratching the surface on this. And there's a couple of things that I'm going to kind of touch on, and then we'll talk about the invasion as a whole. Bombing runs had failed to take out heavily fortified artillery positions on Omaha Beach, and Allied forces were cut down by machine gun fire. They scrambled up the mine-riddled beaches and steep bluffs and took them out by nightfall. So as they're moving up, they're taking out these guns as they can. Approximately 2,400 American troops were killed, wounded, or were unaccounted for. Canadian troops suffered great losses at Juno Beach, and like Omaha Beach, German machine guns were waiting for them. It is estimated that the casualty rate was about 50% for the Canadians before they were able to push beyond the beachfront and chase the Germans inland. When it was all over, the Canadians captured more towns and territory than any other battalion during Operation Overlord.
Am I correct in that part, at that point of the invasion, that all they had was like man-portable mine-sweeping equipment, like Bangalore torpedoes and detectors? The actual, tracked mine-sweeping gear, wasn't there something that did an inordinately long time to get that in there?
Matt, I'm not even familiar with mine-sweeping mechanized tracked vehicles.
Okay.
As far as I know, all the I say mine sweeping. Now, there's a difference in mine sweeping and mine detecting. Mine detecting is a man-held device. Mine sweeping, Hobart with the Brits had what they called Hobart's funnies. There were 6 or 7 different devices that could be mounted on tanks. The flail was one. It was a drum that was covered with, or had chains on it that would just beat the ground to death and blow up these mines.
Yeah.
But there were, if I remember right, there were 8 million mines had been scattered up and down the beach.
Okay.
I
just
from
remember
Calais on down to,
random chunk that was stuck in my head. It seemed like it took a long time before they were actually able to clear beyond.
Well, it was because they didn't have all the mine detecting equipment that they needed.
Got it.
And they had guys down typically, like you've seen, with bayonets, feeling through the sand and then marking where the mines were. And some of these guys suffered consequences. You mentioned the high-level bombing. That was a problem. The B-17s were supposed to saturate the beach. I think it was, I do not remember now who it was not in favor of that, said, no, that's not a good thing to do. It was very, very inaccurate. They came in, there was cloud cover. They didn't drop the bombs. They went on inland and dropped the bombs on other targets of opportunity. But some of the soldiers were told the beach will be pocked with bomb craters. You'll have plenty of places to hide. It didn't happen.
I have a crater story. There were last summer. I was sat in a chemotherapy chair, and across from me was a World War II vet who came in D-Day. And he told the story of being on the landing craft with his buddy, who was said of all the things the guy was worried about was that he was a weak swimmer, and bullets flying and everything else, and he was more worried about swimming. And he said he sort of regurgitated the training about how deep the water's going to be, and that people had already landed and it wasn't that deep, that everybody just ran down the ramp of the vehicle and they were fine. Waist deep water, keep your rifle dry, and head for the beach. And he told his buddy, but don't worry, I'll be there with you. And he said his friend went right in front of him and stepped into a crater and just disappeared, just bloop, underwater. And he knelt down and reached and caught the edge of his helmet, which strapped his chin. He pulled him out and got him righted and out of the crater. And everybody else ran around him. They could tell it was sort of off to one side. And he survived, was later injured, and was hospitalized and was pinned the Purple Heart by General Patton himself. It was kind of cool. So I got to hang out with that guy. Yeah.
The next one that I want to mention is the Point du Hoc, which was the tallest point in between Omaha and Utah Beach. And Army Rangers were to scale the cliff and dismantle 155 millimeter guns that were capable of directly firing upon both beaches. The U.S. 2nd Ranger Battalion would lead the attack, and should they fail, companies from the 5th Ranger Battalion were to take charge, just to go in and complete the mission.
But they were coming in from a different direction.
I didn't run across that. I didn't know they were coming from a different direction.
They were coming from two different directions. They weren't both trying to scale the cliffs.
Prior to the invasion, Allied forces bombarded the cliff from the sea and the air, but were worried that German forces still occupied it, so they sent, whenever they sent the Rangers in, they were still worried that those German forces were there. Because the weather was choppy and the sea was choppy, the bombardment for the day of the invasion had been stopped for about 40 minutes before the Rangers arrived, and that gave time for the German troops to reoccupy that position. The 2nd Rangers scaled the cliff. They were met with great casualties, but they captured Point du Hoc, but intelligence was outdated, as the Germans had moved their guns to a position where they never fired upon American troops. So they just moved them back. On the evening of June 6th, they did make it up the walls. They found the guns, and they destroyed them and then held the position. With the success of the attack, the reserve companies of the 2nd and 5th Ranger Battalions were diverted to the Dog Green sector of Omaha Beach, and they led the assault there. And whenever I read that, it was just there in my head, and I was like, I know that for some reason. I know that. And I went in and looked into it. The film Saving Private Ryan, which depicted, I guess, just a fictionalized version of the attack. I don't know, you can really call that a real version for it, everything. But it was a fictionalized version of the attack. The company that Tom Hanks was in was the 2nd Rangers Battalion. He would have been part of that reserve group, I guess, that led the attack onto Omaha Beach. The Rangers that made it off the beach continued on to Point du Hoc by land, tasked with resisting the German counterattacks, but it would take them 2 days for the reserves to meet up with them, with the Rangers that were stuck at that point to Hawk. And at the end of the battle, only 90 of the 225 men of the 2nd Rangers Battalion were still able to fight.
Wow, I had no idea that number. Wow.
All 5 of the beaches weren't secured until June the 11th. So this wasn't a one-day thing. It was over the course. And the invasion marked a turning point for the war. When it was all said and done, it took years of planning and was the largest amphibious invasion in military history. And it was less than a year after this that Germany would surrender, and you would have victory in Europe.
A few interesting things at Pointe du Hoc. I believe it was Colonel Rader who was over the Ranger Battalion. They had rocket-fired grappling hooks that were shot all the way to the top with the knotted ropes to climb, and they had not collapsible, but extendable ladders also. And several years later, Rader went back and looked up at that thing. This was one of the, probably the 10th or 15th or 20th anniversary, I'm not sure which. And he looked up at that and said, "You tell me how we climbed that." It was almost vertical, and I think it was over 100 feet, 120, 130 feet, something like that. Of course, the Germans were up there, and they were throwing grenades down and shooting down. But
the amount of gear that one soldier carried, especially in those days. I mean, that was, we went clear through into Desert Storm with near the same amount of weight per soldier. And it's just phenomenal in climbing that into that kind of pressure. But
you mentioned that it was, 11 days before the 5 beaches were secured?
It was
June 11th.
It was June 11th, about 6 days,
my cousin, who has my name, same name, William B. Martin, in New Orleans. I was with him a couple of years ago, and we went to the World War II D-Day Museum in New Orleans. And he told me that his dad, who I did know, I didn't spend a lot of time with him, but he got a battlefield promotion on Normandy when I believe it was his first sergeant was killed on the 5th day into Normandy on the beach. So, that would explain a lot of things. I thought that it wasn't anything like that. Now, part of Ambrose's book, the Atlantic Wall, is what we were dealing with here, was claimed to be impenetrable. These guys went through it in 24 hours and were inland.
I was talking with someone earlier today, and I was kind of going over all of this, and I was bouncing ideas off of them, just asking, okay, what do I need to reword? How does this sound? Does this work with this? And after kind of talking all about it, I sat there for a minute and just kind of paused, and the realization kind of hit me that so many things had to have gone wrong and so many things had to have gone right for this outcome to happen, and just the chances of that happening. It's...
I can't imagine being in that war from any angle. And you've hung around my podcast and my friends, and we're into radio, we're into airplanes and cars and shooting and all that. So all of the efforts and all of those things that were in World War II were acts of desperation. This isn't a war for regime change, for economics, for political ideology. This is for life. And what went into it is it's staggering. And the attitude and the mindset of all the soldiers and sailors and airmen that went into it are just incredible to me.
There are several different factors that made the pendulum swing to our side. Our troops were able to make decisions on their own. The Germans did not have that flexibility. We've already seen that Hitler would not release the Panzer divisions except by his own authorization. We were able to make battlefield adjustments without going through the chain of command. And I've heard it said that a first sergeant, a corporal, a private, it's what won this war for us, because so many of the officers and non-coms were killed. Again, sergeants took it on themselves and made an assault here, an assault there. A private took out something. And there were those who were coward on the beach. There's no doubt about that. This was brutal. The bombardment was the gunfire. The guns on all 5 of the beaches were interlocked, so that there was not an uncovered part of those beaches, somewhat area that was not covered by machine gun or mortar fire.
And not just any machine gun.
MG-42.
MG-42. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If you Mike, you and your listeners want to see something interesting, I will get you a link to a, at the time, classified video that came out just before Normandy, explaining it. They were trying to desensitize soldiers and train them on dealing with the MG-42, which was a very well-made German machine gun. They had the highest rate of fire of any light machine gun in that. Light machine gun, or is that medium? Anyway,
I think that was a medium.
Full-on rifle caliber machine gun. I'm horrible with machine guns, sorry. But it was devastating in its rate of fire, and its sustained rate of fire. And it just terrified people, just the sounds. And then they had interlacing fields of these things.
The one drawback of the MG-42 is the short life of the barrel. There were incidents where Allied troops would say, wait till they change the barrel, or wait till they have to reload. Because they had to reload frequently. And it took a few seconds, and I think it was 20 or 30 seconds to change a barrel. But the barrels were shot out real fast on the MG-42 because, like, the extreme high rate of fire. And they were nicknamed Hitler's buzzsaw because it just,
yeah.
It sounded, the sound, and I have heard them on various programs, reminds me of the sound of our minigun.
Yeah, Bert.
Six
Bert.
barrel, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, our miniguns, an A10 on half of its hydraulic motor fires at near the same rate as that MG-42. They're close.
One of the other benefits of the American soldier, German vehicles break down, they would abandon them. Leave them on the side of the road. Our soldiers had grown up working on tractors, trucks and cars at home that, they'd come through the Depression. They didn't have a lot of money to expend on vehicle maintenance. They did their own maintenance. So a truck or a Jeep breaks down, they got out there and fixed it. And one of the major problems in Normandy, well, 2 major problems unforeseen, were the hedgerows. Our aerial photography showed hedgerows, but the hedgerows in Britain, or in Great Britain, were about 2 feet high, 3 feet maybe. The horses went out there chasing the foxes and jumped over these. The hedgerows in Normandy were 8 to 10, 15 feet high, and they were an interlocking mass of roots and trees, and a man couldn't go through it. A tank couldn't go through it. Well, these guys get out here and they start taking in these tetrahedrons that Hitler had out there in the beach, these pieces of angle iron and channel iron, and they made, welded on site to the front of their tanks, I'm trying to remember what they called it, not a bulldog, but dragon's razor or something like that. I don't remember for sure. And it would cut through those hedgerows. Ingenuity. Adapt and overcome, as the Marine says.
Along the lines of the MG-42 and changing the barrels in the time, we've always heard about the M1 Garand ping.
Yep.
Right. And I grew up, hearing stories that Germans would wait for that and then attack. And I come to find out from veterans and all, that's sort of an urban legend, that it didn't really happen that way. But I'll make it short. The M1 Garand uses an actual clip rather than a magazine. When I was a firearms instructor and somebody'd say, I got my clip stuck. I go, no, that's a magazine. Clips go in M1 Garands and women's hair. That's a magazine. But the clip was actually a piece of sheet metal that holds 8 bolts together. You poke it in a certain way, it'll slam shut on your thumb. when you fire your 8th round, it ejects the clip and it makes a pinging sound. So it leaves the mechanism of the gun, it rings. In fact, I should have brought one in here and made the sound for you. I met another World War II vet. I was teaching a class. I was teaching concealed handgun class. And at the time that I was teaching, I was also competing in a rifle marksmanship class just for the M1 Garand. So I have 2 M1 Garand race guns. And we use obviously the same magazines. Well, I had a handful of them in my shooting bag. And the class was taking a test or on a break or something. And I was looking for something I needed to teach the class. And I was digging through my range bag, and I knocked an M1 Garand clip out. It hits the tile floor in this classroom and makes that ring. And this old man with a hearing aid stands up and he turns around. He goes, "Did you bring an M1?" And he said he probably hadn't held an M1 since he got out of the Army, but he could remember that sound.
Oh, man.
Yep. Some things you never forget.
We touched on the incidents of cowardice on Omaha Beach, and there's a very interesting study by a general. His name is S.L.A. Marshall, on the number of soldiers that would engage the enemy at the time. And I may get the story wrong, but I've taught this quite a bit. He inspired essentially a science of understanding killing in normal people. In other words, we want to know why soldiers and police were reluctant to defend their own lives with a firearm. And we knew more about abnormal people killing, serial killers and things like that. So the equivalent of that is, it's like teaching married couples to have better sex by studying rapists. We just didn't have a very successful means of doing that. General Marshall found himself, the story I got was his brother was killed or injured after Normandy, I believe, and he sort of embarked on a journey to find him, which led him to travel with a number of units, and he was disturbed by what he saw as far as the soldiers that were willing to engage in actual combat and that would pick up a gun and shoot at somebody. And one of the things they discovered was not only the training that soldiers received, it was primarily in marksmanship, but also there is a resistance to killing in people. And one of the things was, here are men of European descent trying to kill Europeans. So, and the same thing happened in the Civil War, where we were literally fighting our own relatives, that there were a lot of people who would appear to be fighting but weren't engaging. And so there was a lot of that. If you watch Saving Private Ryan, the young man that's the clerk that's pressed into service, that character was written to kind of exemplify that they're not to be painted necessarily as cowards, but that we have a natural resistance to killing our own kind and that sort of thing. A very, very good book written on the subject is called On Killing by Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman. I was trained by him and passed on a lot of his knowledge in my law enforcement career, and that's a very interesting study.
It really is. I've read it book. In fact, I think it was your book I read.
Yeah. Oh, definitely it was.
But he estimated that from everything he had gathered, about 33% of combat soldiers, only 33% fired their weapon in combat.
Well, and that applies to a single soldier with his weapon trying to kill someone out.
Yeah.
It doesn't apply to crew served weapons. It doesn't apply to artillery. It doesn't apply to aircraft. Yeah. It doesn't apply to mortars, anything like that. That is one guy putting his sights of his rifle on another person.
Fired his weapon.
Yeah, and it was in the 20 to 30% range. Now, when Vietnam came about, that number went into the 80s and 90s. But at the same time, they changed their training, and they were using anatomically correct targets. They were using targets that look like people, and they actually had started using pop-up targets.
Did away with the bullseyes.
Yeah, there were bullseyes.
Silhouette.
We use bullseyes as a diagnostic and competitive tool. We don't teach people to shoot under stress on a perfectly round target because that's what you look for.
It's not realistic.
Yeah. And what happened later in Vietnam, after using those targets, and even if you go look up, a really interesting thing to Google is the Ivan target. The Ivan target has a Russian soldier's helmet. They're plastic and they pop up. They fit on these things. But not only in that, in Vietnam, and Korea. Korea, with the same training as World War II, the engagement numbers went up. So when we combined, and the reason for that was they were not fighting people like them. They were not firing at people that looked like them, that had cultural similarities, that had blue eyes and celebrated Christmas, or they were firing at people that were alien. They were firing at Asians, which the average kid from Nebraska didn't see a whole lot of Korean people. And so you add that to more realistic training techniques, the realistic targets I'm talking about. Now you add the cultural distance, and you have Vietnam, where they would engage at a higher rate. Now they had, by this time, they had given American troops a fully automatic weapon, so they would more than likely poke their arm around a tree and jab the trigger back and dump a magazine in their direction. Mm-hmm. So our rounds per kill, I think, was considerably worse, but they were more likely to engage to try to kill the enemy.
Yeah. I actually ran into that same type of study not too long ago, a while ago, but it was in a different context. And if I can draw this conversation back to my nerd geek roots.
There you go.
Yep. Star Wars, Stormtroopers.
Right.
Whenever they're on Tatooine and they're attacking the Sand People, their aim and precision is very, very good. And they are able to defeat them with little to no effort.
Right.
But whenever they go and they're on something like the Death Star and they're firing against Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, Princess Leia, I guess people don't want to kill people. And
right.
So they're aiming high or aiming off so that way they don't hit and kill another person.
Right. I taught this so much that I used to remember the numbers. One of the most interesting things that came up in this general study later was the muskets recovered at the Battle of Gettysburg, that they found them loaded multiple times. Yeah. And they replicated, I think the record was 21 times. And they would load period rifles with period ammunition and load it 21 times and fire it. Well, they wouldn't explode. They'd just kind of puff and blow everything out the barrel. The powder was very different. And so we would do this on the range when we had time. I'd take a black powder gun and time how long it took me to fire 2 shots. Okay, so let's say go, bang, and then you take it out and just for safety's sake, swab it once to get the embers, powder, patch, ball, ram it, prime it, bang. And the actual time that you're going bang is very short. What are you doing the rest of the time? Well, you're loading. Mm-hmm. And so they said there were soldiers, if they didn't want to shoot, they would just load and keep loading and keep loading. And so they did that instead of actually engaging someone. But like you said, I've never heard that Star Wars analogy. Yeah. But that is absolutely brilliant, because if you get a kid on a crew-served weapon, I forget what we had a really good anti-tank gun at the time, not the bazooka, but anyway, it's a small cannon.
It was a tripod-mounted. I think it was more than a 50 caliber.
It's like a mountain rifle, 20 millimeter, something, whatever we would have had at the time. Yeah. But you're sitting there with 3 other guys. Yeah. So if you would imagine, you would have the 3 of us, where Mike's firing the weapon, I'm sighting the weapon and cranking, traverse and elevation, and Bill's schlepping ammo. They're going to know if somebody's not doing their job. And so, we're shooting at a tank, and plus it's a tank. It's not a person, it's a tank. Yeah. And that would totally explain why the stormtroopers never hit anything but the big Java transport. Yeah. That's brilliant. I love it.
I think that's going to do it for us today. I want to thank Matt Vann, everyone knows from the Vann Cave, and Bill Martin here, who has been on the Vann Cave a couple of times. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. This has been fun. I appreciate the invite.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed it. But anybody looking or watching this, listening to it, I am not an expert on Normandy. I am a student.
But you are our expert.
Yeah. Okay, I will accept that. I'll accept that. Yeah.
In other words, you could have made all of this up, and Mike and I will never know.
I'd have just nodded and been like, yeah, that sounds like that would have happened.
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't know why it is I hated history when I was in high school and college. Maybe it's because I had a father and two brothers that were in World War II, but I have become, and of course, part of it was watching Band of Brothers. That just kind of got me, and I have really, really enjoyed reading and studying both the Pacific and the European war. So there's so much history there, and we have so many people to be so thankful for.
Yeah.
Indeed. Well said.
If you're watching this on YouTube, you can find the audio version on iTunes, Podbean, Spotify, and Google Play. Links in the description. If you like the podcast and want to hear more, please give us a rate and a review. That helps me out and lets me know what direction to keep this going in. And hey, if you liked it, share it with a friend. They might like it too. You can find me on social media and at YouTube at the Apple Cider Club. And as always, I want to thank the Tim Christ Band for our musical theme and to thank you for listening. We'll see you next time, and get ready for the sound effect.